It is just after midnight on May 17, 1943, and above the black water of the Möhne reservoir in the Ruhr Valley, a Lancaster bomber drops to 60 feet. Inside the cockpit, Wing Commander Guy Gibson watches two spotlights converge into a single dot on the water below him, the signal that his altitude is correct. Behind him, in the belly of the aircraft, a strange cylindrical weapon spins at 500 revolutions per minute, driven by a small motor connected by belt to an external mechanism. It looks nothing like a conventional bomb. It looks, if anything, like an oil drum. The dam looms ahead, floodlit now by German searchlights that have found the aircraft and begun to fire. Gibson gives the order to release. The strange spinning drum falls, strikes the water, and to the astonishment of anyone watching from the ground who had never seen such a thing before, it does not sink. It bounces, once, twice, 3 times, skipping across the surface of the reservoir like a stone thrown by a child, before striking the dam wall, sinking to a preset depth, and detonating. Moments later, a wall that had held back millions of tons of water for decades gives way. This is the story of the bomb that should not have worked, built by a man the Air Ministry did not initially believe, and used in one of the most audacious raids of the Second World War. It matters not simply because of what it destroyed, but because of what it proved, that a problem considered technically impossible by conventional thinking could be solved by a design so unconventional that it took years to convince anyone to try it. By 1942, Britain's Bomber Command had a problem that no amount of raw tonnage seemed able to solve. The industrial heartland of Nazi Germany, the Ruhr Valley, was protected not merely by anti-aircraft guns and fighter squadrons but by geography and engineering. 3 vast dams, the Möhne, the Eder, and the Sorpe, held back the water that powered hydroelectric stations, supplied drinking water to millions, and fed the canals along which coal and steel moved to feed the German war machine. These were not ordinary structures. The Möhne Dam alone was a masonry gravity structure some 40 meters high and over 600 meters long, holding back a reservoir of 134 million cubic meters of water. Conventional bombing had already been tried against similar targets and had failed comprehensively. High explosive bombs dropped from altitude either missed such a narrow target entirely or, when they did strike, exploded harmlessly against the thick masonry face without penetrating to the point where the force of detonation could do meaningful damage. The dams had, in effect, been engineered to be immune to the bombing tactics of the era. Torpedoes were considered and dismissed, since the Germans had already strung anti-torpedo nets across the approaches to the reservoirs, a defense that rendered any weapon traveling in a straight line through the water essentially useless. To breach a dam of this scale required a very large explosive charge detonated at exactly the right depth, directly against the dam wall itself, a feat that seemed to demand a level of accuracy no aircraft of the period could realistically achieve, while also avoiding the underwater netting that made a direct approach impossible. It was, by the assessment of most engineers who studied it, not a solvable problem within existing technology. That assessment turned out to be wrong, but only because one man refused to accept it. That man was Barnes Wallis, an aeronautical engineer at Vickers Armstrong's who had already made his name designing the geodetic airframe of the Wellington bomber. Wallis had become convinced, through his own calculations and a series of increasingly elaborate experiments, that the dams could be breached, but only by a weapon that behaved in a way no bomb ever had before. His insight, developed initially through skimming marbles across a tin bath of water in his own garden, was that a cylindrical charge, spun rapidly backwards before release, would skip across the surface of water in a series of diminishing bounces, exactly as a flat stone skims when thrown correctly by a child at a lake. Crucially, the backspin would do 2 further things. It would keep the weapon in contact with the dam wall as it began to sink, rather than bouncing away from it, and it would counteract the tendency of a normal falling bomb to travel forward after impact, meaning the weapon would hug the vertical face of the dam as it sank to its detonation depth. This meant the anti-torpedo netting became irrelevant. since the weapon never traveled beneath the surface until it had already reached the wall. Wallace refined the concept through hundreds of test drops, first with scaled-down models at the National Physical Laboratory, then with full-sized prototypes dropped from modified Wellington and later Lancaster bombers over the coast and inland reservoirs of Britain. The final weapon, codenamed Upkeep, weighed roughly 4,200 kilograms, of which some 2,900 kilograms was Torpex explosive, a compound considerably more powerful than the TNT used in conventional bombs of the period. It was cylindrical rather than the teardrop shape of a normal bomb, measuring about 1.5 meters in diameter, and had to be spun up to speed by a belt-driven motor inside the aircraft before release, at exactly 60 feet above the water and exactly 232 miles per hour, figures so precise that entirely new instruments had to be devised simply to allow pilots to judge them accurately at night. Altitude was measured using two downward-pointing spotlights, positioned so their beams converged into a single point on the water's surface only when the aircraft was at precisely the correct height, a low-technology solution to a problem that more sophisticated instruments of the day could not solve reliably enough. The Lancasters selected to carry Upkeep, an aircraft never designed to carry anything remotely like it, had their bomb bay doors removed entirely and replaced with a pair of calipers that gripped the drum-shaped weapon and spun it before release. The specialist unit formed to fly the mission, 617 Squadron, was assembled in barely 2 months at RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire under Guy Gibson's command, training pilots to fly at heights and speeds that in most circumstances would have been considered suicidal, across British reservoirs chosen specifically because their dimensions approximated those of the German targets. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The raid itself took place on the night of 16th to 17th May 1943, with 19 Lancasters departing in 3 waves to attack the Möhne, Eder, and Sorpe dams. The attack on the Möhne required repeated runs by successive aircraft, since the dam's defenses, though eventually suppressed, forced pilots to fly directly into anti-aircraft fire at an altitude and speed that left no room for evasive maneuver. Gibson's own aircraft made the first drop, and it was the 5th Upkeep released that finally breached the wall, sending a wall of water estimated at several meters high surging down the valley below. The Eder Dam, though less heavily defended, presented an even more difficult approach due to the surrounding hills, and was breached by the second wave after several attempts. The Sorpe Dam, built using an earthen construction rather than masonry, proved resistant to the weapon's effects and was damaged but not breached, a result that later analysis suggested Wallace himself had anticipated given the differences in construction. Of the 19 aircraft that took off, 8 failed to return, and 53 of the young men who had trained at Scampton were killed that night, a casualty rate that, even by the standards of Bomber Command's already brutal loss figures, was severe. On the ground, German records that survived the war describe scenes of chaos as the floodwaters swept through the valley below the Möhne in the early hours of the morning, destroying bridges, power stations, and farmland, and killing an estimated 1,600 people, a significant proportion of whom were forced laborers, many from Eastern Europe, housed in camps directly in the flood's path. Industrial production in the region was disrupted for a period, though the Germans mobilized an enormous labor force, reportedly diverting workers from the Atlantic Wall fortifications, to repair the Möhne Dam within months. The comparison with German and American approaches to similar problems is instructive. Germany never developed an equivalent weapon, in part because its own dam-busting requirements were limited by circumstance, but German engineers who studied the wreckage of the raid and the surviving technical assessments were reportedly startled by the sophistication of a weapon that achieved its effect through mechanical spin rather than brute explosive force. The Americans, by contrast, pursued precision bombing doctrine built around accuracy from high altitude using the Norden bomb sight, a philosophy fundamentally at odds with the low-level, close-range approach that Upkeep demanded. Where American doctrine sought to solve the accuracy problem through better aiming from a safer height, Wallace solved it by redefining the entire physics of how the weapon would reach its target, accepting enormous risk to the aircrew in exchange for a delivery method that made conventional defenses irrelevant. No other air force of the period fielded anything resembling a bouncing bomb, and the concept remained essentially unique to 617 Squadron, whose name itself became forever associated with precision attacks against structures once thought unreachable, later reused by the RAF for further specialist bombing operations using Wallace's subsequent designs, the Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs. The comparison with German and American approaches to similar problems is instructive. Germany never developed an equivalent weapon, in part because its own dam-busting requirements were limited by circumstance. But German engineers who studied the wreckage of the raid and the surviving technical assessments were reportedly startled by the sophistication of a weapon that achieved its effect through mechanical spin rather than brute explosive force. The Americans, by contrast, pursued precision bombing doctrine built around accuracy from high altitude using the Norden bomb sight, a philosophy fundamentally at odds with the low-level, close-range approach that upkeep demanded. Where American doctrine sought to solve the accuracy problem through better aiming from a safer height, Wallace solved it by redefining the entire physics of how the weapon would reach its target, accepting enormous risk to the aircrew in exchange for a delivery method that made conventional defenses irrelevant. No other air force of the period fielded anything resembling a bouncing bomb, and the concept remained essentially unique to 617 Squadron, whose name itself became forever associated with precision attacks against structures once thought unreachable, later reused by the RAF for further specialist bombing operations using Wallace's subsequent designs, the Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs. The material impact of the Dambusters raid has been debated by historians for decades, and honesty compels an acknowledgement that the immediate industrial disruption, while real, was less severe and shorter-lived than British propaganda claimed at the time. German records suggest that full hydroelectric output was restored within weeks in some areas, and the diversion of labor to repairs, while costly, did not cripple war production in the way early assessments hoped. What is far less contested is the psychological and propaganda impact, both on German morale in the immediate aftermath and on British and Allied confidence at a stage of the war when good news was in short supply. The raid demonstrated that Britain possessed the technical ingenuity and the sheer nerve to strike at targets previously considered untouchable, and it gave Bomber Command a public triumph that no amount of statistical analysis of industrial output could fully undo in the public imagination. The weapon's legacy also extended well beyond the raid itself, since the low-level precision techniques developed by 617 Squadron and the broader philosophy that unconventional engineering could defeat seemingly impossible defensive problems influenced Wallace's subsequent work on the far larger Tallboy and Grand Slam bombs, weapons that would later prove decisive against reinforced U-boat pens and the battleship Tirpitz. Surviving examples of the upkeep weapon, along with a preserved Lancaster and extensive material relating to the raid, can today be seen at the Royal Air Force Museum and at the Dambusters heritage sites near Scampton, while the Möhne Dam itself, rebuilt within the year, still stands and still performs its original function. Return for a moment to that night above the Möhne. A weapon shaped like nothing that had ever been dropped from an aircraft before, spinning in the dark belly of a Lancaster, released at a height and speed that left no margin for error, striking water it should by any reasonable expectation have simply sunk into, and instead skipping across the surface exactly as its designer had promised it would. It should not have worked. Every instinct of conventional military engineering said it should not have worked, and yet it did, because one engineer refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable, and because a group of young airmen were willing to fly a mission that gave them almost no room for survival in order to prove him right. 53 of those airmen never came home. The dam they breached was rebuilt within the year. The industrial output it was meant to cripple recovered faster than anyone in London wanted to admit. And yet the raid endures, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it revealed about the willingness of desperate people to solve impossible problems in ways no one else had thought to try. A bomb that bounced across the water to breach a wall that had stood for decades was never really about the dam at all. It was about proving that impossible was a word applied too quickly by people who had not yet met Barnes-Wallis and had not yet watched his strange spinning drum skip once, twice, 3 times across the black water of the Möhne before doing exactly what he had said it would.